Live from the Talking Joe studios, it's Talking Joe.
Talking Joe is on the air.
Hey, it's me, Mark, and you are listening to Talking Joe, the G.I. Joe Comics podcast. Now, today I am joined by Brian Hickey and Paddy Lennon of Total Toy Books. A few weeks ago, I live streamed to our YouTube account their JoeFest 2024 panel. And the technical standards of that live stream weren't the best. It was an echoey room. The mics weren't working especially well. The connection, the Wi-Fi connection wasn't especially brilliant. It was in quite a bright room. So for the slides and things, that didn't necessarily record at best. So I wanted to have another go at this one. So we arranged to do a live stream from home. Better connection, better sound, better visuals, and all of the rest of it. So we live streamed via the Talking Joe YouTube channel one evening recently, and I thought it might be fun to just deliver this as an audio-only podcast as well for the people who are not into the YouTube streaming. So today, Brian and Paddy will deliver a version of their JoeFest panel, sort of covering some of the history of Action Force, Palitoy toys, and segueing into Battle Action Force and the comics and their brand new Treasury editions that are going to be published very soon, and for which the early bird discounted offer will be expiring shortly. So there is a little bit of a call for action in this podcast to get on the early bird offer and get 3 books for the price of 2 before that offer closes down later on in August. I do have to caveat that as we recorded this one, firstly, there are visuals that are being shared on screen and being talked to. If you're on the Patreon, I'll share a PDF of that. And if you want to get the full visuals, the full experience, then head on over to Talking Joe YouTube page where you can see the visuals as well as hear everything. My mic was playing up as we were recording this, so apologies for that. I've tried to kind of correct for the worst effects of that. Now, with that intro all done, let's get on over to the talk with Brian and Paddy.
Gee, Mark, what are we gonna do today?
The same thing we do every day, Mark. Make jingles for our new guests. It's Paddy and Brian. Yes, Paddy and Brian. One is a writer, the other is trying to take some photographs for Kickstarter bucks. It's Paddy and Brian.
Hey.
I was not expecting that. I think you used that last time we were on, and every time I see it, it's still a surprise.
I love that intro. That's the best intro video ever.
So, how are you guys doing today?
Doing great, Mark. Doing great. Great to be back chatting to you.
Yeah, very good. Fully recovered from JoeFest now. Although, as I was saying before we got on the call here, I still haven't opened everything because I bought a lot. And yet, even today, I was thinking, God, I missed a few things. I should have probably bought more of certain items, or just the scale of the show is so huge, and because we were working our own table, you just didn't get time to go around and see everything. Even now, I'm finding out that there was vendors there who had things I probably would have bought, and just didn't see them or didn't see the items or whatever. They really should just give the vendors a day to themselves to take a nice leisurely stroll around the hall. To see everything, or give us a couple extra hours on the Friday or something, because I wish I missed out on a few things I probably would have liked to have gotten, even though I still have a box full of unopened toys there behind me.
Absolutely. I had a few people even commenting saying that because you guys were set up with your own table promoting the wares, that you're talking to everyone all about. A lot of people were sort of describing it as a real highlight for them. So, I think you guys did go down a storm.
That was one of the things I loved most about JoeFest was being able to talk to so many people about the Battle Action Force comics. I really wasn't expecting there to be so many, interested people coming by our table, um, and obviously it's a major passion of mine. So I was happy to talk all weekend about it, um, and really looking forward for the opportunity to talk more about it tonight on the show.
Very good. So, why don't you tee up sort of the agenda for today? So, I guess this was done as a Joe's Fest panel to introduce, with the context of your current pre-order in mind. So, yeah, let's introduce the context and then sort of go in.
So what we've got is this is our presentation. I'm going to get it up on the screen here now, but essentially what it is, it gives a very brief introduction to the history of Palitoy and how that leads into Action Force, the toys, Palitoy's Action Force toy line, and then of course the comic tie-in, which was a key part of their overall marketing strategy. For that. So that's the kind of the magical mystery tour we're going to take people on for the next, I don't know, 40 minutes or so. And of course, if people have questions in the chat while we're going through this, pop them in there, and we'll take those questions. So as we cue this up here, so it's our Action Force Toys and Comics, an introduction. And we've got the prologue to this, as we said at the top, is a little bit of history about Palitoy. And prior to Palitoy kind of ever getting into 3 3/4 inch scale action figures, they had a really strong track record in licensed toys and in design innovation, particularly around dolls. So in 1964, when Hasbro came out with their G.I. Joe line, Palitoy picked up the license for that, and in 1966 released Action Man, which initially was as the very first release, it was just straight up the GI Joe, but over time, Palitoy would gradually make it their own.
I think actually, and it's very quickly that Palitoy started bringing in their own items, because obviously they just had the GI Joe product, which was reboxed for the UK market, but it was such a huge seller that Palitoy couldn't keep up with the production. So what they had done at the time was, instead of borrowing the molds, so sometimes Palitoy would borrow molds from Hasbro for a period of time to make their production run for the year. And other times they would duplicate the molds if they thought that the product was going to sell particularly well. So in the case of Action Man, Palitoy duplicated the molds from Hasbro, so they had their own production facilities running basically 24/7, to the extent that they had to ramp up production significantly for Action Man, but they still couldn't keep up with demand, and they ended up in that first kind of year or so of Palitoy Action Man. They ended up just asking Hasbro to ship over additional stock from, I believe it was Canada. You were getting Canadian boxed GI Joes, where they would slap a Palitoy sticker and an Action Man sticker on the package, because it was so successful for Palitoy straight out of the gate. And that kind of led them immediately to decide, well, we need to make our own uniforms, particularly, and our own play sets. So this is one of the first play sets they did, which is the Arctic Explorer. But you'll see very quickly they decided to make their own kind of British themed accessories and outfits. And I think part of the reason why Palitoy's Action Man series ran for a lot longer than G.I. Joe did in the States is because they straight away jumped into, it wasn't just a military toy line, it was an overall adventure toy line. So obviously you see here you have the Arctic Explorer set, but they quickly introduced things like, sports stars, a soccer outfit, and mountaineering and things like that they would look at, what's in the sports were popular, kind of rugged adventure sports were popular at the time, and they would replicate outfits for that, which, weren't released in the States. So you had all this Palitoy produced exclusive items that kind of broadened and deepened the adventure part of the G.I. Joe mythos.
Had a space theme towards it.
Yeah. I think we should have some examples of that later on, where when Star Wars hit, they in 1977, 78, they immediately pivoted to the space team, because they knew what was popular, they knew what was selling, they knew what their own, Palitoy were very close to the retailers in the UK as well. And they had direct channels with them as well. So the retailers would say, this is what people are looking for. And they would, and Palitoy would produce it. It's quite funny. We were talking to the former marketing manager in Palitoy there a few months ago, just before we went to JoeFest, and she had mentioned that the only reason that retailers in the UK would take Star Wars toys is because they were offered massive discounts on Action Man to take it.
That's true.
Because Action Man was a perennial seller, really, really big seller for retailers.
We're jumping way ahead in the presentation, though. We're still in 1966 here. Still in 1966. So again, this is part of this sort of brief history of Palitoy. So we talked about they quickly made Action Man their own, and of course, you know, as well as designing all those kind of cool accessories and different uniforms, that Paddy just spoke about there, they also brought innovations into the actual figure, the action figure itself. And one of those is famously the gripping hand, modeled off Bob Breaken's own left hand.
And which Bob Breaken had at JoeFest.
Yes.
He was showing off to people as well, the original sculpt.
The flocked hair is obviously another Palitoy innovation that they brought to Action Man. The sharpshooter head, but it's a little kind of like Adam's apple that the head could lock behind to get that kind of, the sharpshooter pose. And eventually they would completely redesign the entire doll, the entire figure itself. Taking out all the metal rivets were gone, and it was entirely made of plastic parts. So again, that just gives you a little bit of insight into that sort of, it's innovation. And of course, then through the 1970s, when the original G.I. Joe was kind of taking a nosedive in sales, Hasbro's Action Man was skyrocketing, and it would actually come to be known as kind of toy of the decade at the end of the 1970s. And all of that Action Man success actually helped to keep Hasbro, in the cash, because Palitoy were raking it in and paying those kind of, license fees over to Hasbro, which is an important part of this overall history of Action Force story, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we get into the Action Force history. So Action Man was doing really, really well for Palitoy. And even, when Star Wars when the Star Wars toys were coming to market, Palitoy's Paddy even said it there, they didn't really think they didn't even want Star Wars because Action Man was so successful.
Yeah, and as I was saying, retailers didn't want Star Wars either because it was an untested, obviously a movie. Movie toy lines typically did not sell very well. They would come out in a blaze of glory, and then after 3 months, everybody had forgotten about the film, and retailers are typically left with a lot of stock. So Palitoy had brought over kind of licensed products before. For example, they'd brought over Bonanza, if you remember the TV series, that hadn't done particularly well for them. They bought over other things, other movie toy lines and other kind of TV tie-in toy lines as well, and none of them had really hit in a big way. So obviously, Palitoy were kind of reticent to take Star Wars, and the retailers were reticent to take Star Wars as well at that time.
So this kind of leads into to the rise of Action Force. So we had obviously that huge success of Action Man. Star Wars would eventually become massively successful, and of course Palitoy couldn't ignore that the market was going in a particular direction, which was 3 3/4 inch scaled figures. So the idea was to develop their own unique action figure line, and how that kind of started conceptually was Bob Breaken and his team took a look at some of the more futuristic designs that were being done for Action Man at that time. And Bob wanted to develop a line of figures based on that. So what we see here right now are these are Action Man concepts done by Palitoy designer Greg Hughes. And Bob took inspiration from those to develop an Action Force line inspired by Greg Hughes's designs. But the head of marketing at the time said, look, let's just make it a straight up copy of our top selling Action Man uniforms. So ignoring the kind of the more futuristic look and going with something that has maybe a little bit more of a traditional military kind of look.
Yeah. You can see there as well, a couple of those concepts do end up showing up in Action Force. You have the night attack there, second last one on that line row there from Bob. So they did use some of it, and you can see even some of the helmets look a little bit are used in some of the Action Force in there as well. With the helmet with the microphone is present in a lot of those kind of more modern looking Action Force figures too. So not all those concepts went to waste in the end.
What's interesting here is that you can see, and this is an observation for me, that initial is clearly all 5 POA figures, but when you look at the kind of the series 1 drawings there in the bottom row, you can see some of them have elbow and even what looks like knee articulation there.
Yeah, the German stormtrooper there, it's quite visible that he has elbow articulation there.
So these are obviously done, still early on in the process. Would they copy the Star Wars format, or would they go for something with a little bit more articulation? And it's important to note that at this time, while this was happening, at the same time in America, Hasbro were developing their G.I. Joe 3 3/4 inch line, but neither Palitoy nor Hasbro knew what the other company was doing, even though they had that relationship with Action Man, which is obviously very lucrative for both companies. The 3 3/4 lines being developed were all top secret, so nobody knew what they were doing. Here's some more concept work around that initial sort of Action Force lineup. This is one of the Raffo and Pape sketches, or Raffo and Pape sketches, for what would become the AF5 vehicle, I think it is.
Mm-hmm. And the AF3 Jeep as well. And actually, you can see there's a few differences. Like most of what was going to be released is there, but you see there's the addition of the skis on the multi-mission vehicle, and then an additional missile launcher on what was going to become the Z-Force Jeep eventually. So obviously those things were probably costed out from the final product. But I think these are kind of interesting images to see what was being worked on at the time, and also what did carry through to the final vehicles. You see there's a lot, like 90%, they're 90% there for what was eventually released.
Yeah, and then this is what the Series 1 lineup would look like when that came out. These are actually the painted up prototypes. So these aren't, production samples. These are the resin prototypes that were displayed at Toy Fair. And we can see there's a few figures here that we didn't get, like the United Nations trooper up there in the top left. Variants on the ground assault, a more kind of, greens camo version of on the ground assault up there at the top center.
And you called it out earlier, but just to emphasize it, this initial wave of Action Force in the 3 3/4 inch scale was basically just a shrunk down version of some of the most popular 12-inch Action Man toys that were already available in that kind of larger scale.
Yeah, that was correct. They very much wanted to just, these things are already successful. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's get them out there again in this smaller scale.
And so these were revealed at Toy Fair in I think it was January 1982. And then only a couple of weeks later, and here's the Toy Fair display for Action Force. So you can see that a lot of the graphics that they have in their panels there are actually showing some of the prototype pieces. And then, as in like the vehicles, the photos of the vehicles are only still prototype stage. And I think even the command center in one of the images there is still a prototype as well. And then a couple of weeks later, Hasbro revealed their G.I. Joe lineup in the United States Toy Fair counterpart. I think might have been the New York Toy Fair.
Well, it was New York is typically February, yes. So the London and Brighton Toy Fairs were typically kind of January time. As European Toy Fairs tend to be kind of January, and then the New York Toy Fair tended to be February at the time. So yeah, I mean, G.I. Joe was released was revealed within 4 weeks of Action Force.
So basically, actually, almost straight away, plans were afoot to revamp Action Force. And when we interviewed Kirk Bazigian for Total Action Force Volume 2, he let us know that almost immediately becoming aware of Palitoy's Action Force line, they got straight on. Hasbro contacted Palitoy and asked would they carry the G.I. Joe line straight away. They were obviously, saw Palitoy as a very kind of lucrative client. The license fees from Action Man were still coming into Hasbro at this stage. And the opportunity to try and further develop that with the 3 3/4 inch G.I. Joe certainly wasn't missed by Hasbro. They got straight onto Palitoy, and almost immediately we start seeing Palitoy developing stuff that would become how they could redevelop Action Force to integrate some of that Hasbro product. And what we've got up on the screen here are some very early sketches by Bob Breakin to develop a more fantasy-based version of Action Force. And you can see here these guys have got, I don't want to say futuristic vibe, but certainly not a traditional military look to them. And notice the emblem that's on their uniforms. That would become the Space Force logo a little bit later. And taking those, if you like, those kind of sketches that Bob did, we can see some of these initial kind of design concepts that were developed very early on for I know there's names like Special Weapons Force and Air Force have kind of been bandied about, to describe these, but as I see it, this is kind of, the design team kind of playing with different ways to integrate the Hasbro product to give Action Force a refresh, but have a very much a fantasy sci-fi kind of look to it.
I've always appreciated that Air Force team that actually don't have a flying vehicle. Always makes me chuckle. Special Weapons Force, they look pretty cool. You got the VAP repaint, you got the MMS repaint, and then our Air Force guys, you have a guy wearing a parachute pack, but he doesn't have an aircraft to jump out of. So it's probably for the best that team didn't make it to market in the end.
And of course, they had the idea of developing a bad guy that they could battle against was also being developed, and they seem to have kind of nailed the Red Shadows look, right out of the gate. Although we can see that Baron Ironblood here they had a very kind of very different look for Baron Ironblood than what we would get in the final what we call Action Force Series 2 lineup, which kind of looks like this. So we can still see that some of that sci-fi look was kind of incorporated with Space Force. Even Q Force have some sort of very futuristic looking elements, but to balance that, there's a very kind of modern military look with the Z Force and SAS Force teams, completing the lineup there.
And even with this photo here, you can see there's a lot of there's a lot of stuff that didn't go on to make it to market. So the Cosmic Cruiser there looks quite different to what the production model ended up looking like. You have that extra engine on top, and the canopy is very, very different. And obviously you have the Space Patroller and Security Trooper look very different to how they ended up being in the end as well. You can see their helmet is an actual helmet covering a head, whereas obviously in the final figure it's just a single piece. So there's a lot of changes even in this, even though this is quite close to when they're making it to market. There is still quite a lot of changes that would happen from those prototypes to production models.
There was a lot of change right up to the last minute before release. There were changes on this.
Pecky Nicky Films in the comments points out the reuse of the moulds between the first and second waves. We get to see Diver first as a sort of standalone Diver, then as part of Q Force, and then again as Muton later. So a lot of reuse.
Yeah, pretty much. They used everything from Series 1, again to make the Series 2 figures. And they used pretty much everything because, as Bob Brecken says, they were forced to kit bash everything for Series 2 from Series 1. So you see a lot of reuse of parts, And as you saw, the lineup there of the initial GI Joe lineup, all of those items from that initial first year of GI Joe ended up being released in the line in some fashion. Even the jump platform, the rocket pack, ends up being bundled in with Leviathan, the deep sea diver, in the end. So Palitoy used everything to get their hands on, really, to get that series 2 out. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, and we look at some of these unproduced concepts that myself and Brian found as well.
So just kind of a last sort of note on this particular image. We can see when we started off this particular section talking about kind of, Hasbro trying to get Palitoy to take the license for the 3 3/4 inch GI Joe, and of course here we see what that looked like with the Mobat, the Ram, the Flak, the mobile missile system, the Vamp, and even the HAL, all integrated in here as part of this kind of new revitalized Action Force look. But still lots of original Palitoy vehicles, along the bottom left with the Shadow Track, the what would become the Swordfish, the Cosmic Cruiser, and the Space Patroller.
Satellite defense.
And to call out here the drivers that for the UK originated vehicles like that Z-Force Jeep, you'd get a 5-point of articulation sort of green man with non-bendy arms and legs, whereas the GI Joe originated vehicles like the Vamp or the Mobats or the Ram, you would get the likes of a repainted Snake Eyes or Scarlet or Steeler coming with those vehicles, for example.
Absolutely, Mark. I mean, in fact, it was that they had to take the GI Joe figures to go with those vehicles because you just can't, trying to get a 5 POA Action Force figure into the Vamp is really difficult. So
it is possible, but actually Palitoy retooled the Vamp tooling to be able to fit a 5 POA passenger in. So the Panther is it's got slightly different tooling to the Vamp, to allow that little bit of extra space to get a 5 POA into the passenger seat.
That's really cool. I didn't know that. That is
there is slightly different. There's a little bit more space there in the passenger seat, because I have a 5 POA Eagle sitting in my Panther there behind the press. So they did do a little bits of tooling there to make things fit when they needed to.
It's probably, we could just segue briefly here and talk about Quarrel, because we've got Quarrel obviously in this image here with the rapid fire motorcycle, and we know Quarrel was released there recently, or got a classified version release announcement earlier this week, which kind of prompted a few people to ask the question, like, who is Quarrel? So I think this would give you a little bit of background into that. So clearly it's the Scarlet figure from G.I. Joe, repainted in the Z-Force colours and with a new kind of hairdo. And she's a kind of a key character in the Z-Force mythology that you see told in the comics.
There was a lot of just real ingenuity in the reuse here. Again, Pecky Necky is pointing out that black SAS boat originally saw use as the roof of the Jeep and then was re-released
as
an SAS boat.
Again, it's Palitoy using what they had to try and get something out to market. They're very Palitoy at the time were very cognizant of price points and what they could release at the different price points. Another thing we learned from the Star Wars research was that for the X-Wing, for example, from Star Wars, the retailers basically told Palitoy, this thing cannot cost more than £10 for the X-Wing. And Palitoy, in the end, Palitoy retooled the Kenner X-Wing toy to take out the electronics to bring the price down underneath that £10 price point. And that's the rationale for the differences there between the Palitoy and the Kenner X-Wing. And it was the same with the Landspeeder. Luke's. You're better on Star Wars than me, Brian. Luke's.
It's the Landspeeder. Luke's Landspeeder.
It's the Landspeeder, yeah. That was retooled by Palitoy as well, because again they had to bring it in at a lower price point because retailers wouldn't take it otherwise. So they really were they had to use their ingenuity on certain things because of what the market was like at the time.
So just to put this on the timeline where we're at here, this is all still 1982. So remember, Action Force was released by Palitoy in 1982, January 1982, and this image here, it's still 1982. So it was completely redeveloped behind the scenes in the space of a few months. So here's a nice little kind of segue here, and I'm going to let Paddy bring us through these next few pieces, which were discovered in an archive of photos that Bob Breakin shared with us as part of the research on the My Palitoy storybook.
So yeah, Bob sent Brian several boxes of slides from those old kind of rotary slide machines. And myself and Brian spent a day going through these hundreds of slides. See, what's interesting in here, what have we not seen before? And we found maybe, I'd say, 30 to 40 kind of Action Force related slides that maybe haven't been seen before. And here's the first one. So this is obviously the satellite defense painted up in red shadows livery. Now, we did ask Bob what these photos are. And he says he remembers the photos, but he doesn't remember why they're done. We suspect that this and the other photos that you're going to see here now are basically the result of a kit bashing session amongst Palitoy designers. Again, taking what they had access to and deciding what can we do to this to release it again. So you have this, like I said, red shadows satellite defense. I guess you'd call it like the satellite attacker or something. But I think it's pretty cool. If anybody wants to do a custom of it, go right ahead. But it is pretty much just a straight repaint of the satellite defense done in red shadows color scheme that they were planning to do, that they maybe had internally decided maybe we look at doing this. The second vehicle is very, very interesting. So this is what appears to be a concept for a Z-Force tank. So the base of this, and we have to thank James and Ray Murphy, who were with us at JoeFest, who helped us work out what parts there are on this. This is a kit bash of an Airfix Saladin model kit, which would have been 135 scale. There are parts from the satellite defense there, the twin cannon in the turret. And then the hatch on the turret is a piece of a TIE fighter. Palitoy owned Airfix at one point. So obviously the Palitoy design team could have just walked into the factory shop and picked up Airfix kits to use in there when they were kind of kit bashing things together. So that's what this appears to be, a 135 scale Saladin, which is a two-seater armoured car, would obviously, if in 118 scale, would be a one-seater armoured car. But the hatches would have been too small, but a figure in, which is why they necessitated taking the hatch off of a TIE fighter to make sure you could literally slice off the top of the turret there, put on a TIE fighter piece, so you would have a properly scaled hatch to get your figures in and out. So that is, don't know what that would have been called, don't know why it wasn't released. I think it would have been pretty cool, a little armoured car for Z-Force. But yeah, we had a fun half an hour at JoeFest there trying to work out what pieces were in this, and particularly what was the model of armoured car. This next item is a Z-Force version of the Hawk with Steeler is sitting there in the pilot seat. Not really much to say about this. It looks like they did consider at one point doing a Z-Force version of the Fang. We cannot figure out what that landing pad is that it's on. Although, and you'll see in that second another image that Brian has shared there, it is those side panels fold down and there's wheels underneath to make it like a mobile landing pad for the Hawk. If anybody knows what that piece might be, do let us know. It's not from the headquarters, as far as we can tell, the G.I. Joe headquarters, which later obviously was repainted as the Z-Force headquarters. So it's not obvious what that piece is, to us at least. You can see there it was going to be part of a towable set with a Palitoy originated tank, which looks to be about the same size as an armadillo. Again, that tank seems to be built out of satellite defense parts, and again, pieces from a Airfix model kit used for the tracks. And again, the guys were trying to figure out which exactly model of tank that is. at 135 scale, but we couldn't figure it out. And they were going through like military history websites trying to figure out which tanks had wheels that were exactly like that. But in the end, we couldn't figure it out. So those are just 4 of the pieces from Bob's collection of slides that he had. These are kind of Polaroids taken off the slides, which is why the image quality is the way it is. But I think these would be part of the reason we wanted to show these off, is because, this is, would be exciting for collectors, I think, to know that these things were kind of in the background being worked on.
What I love about this is it shows the creativity of the design team at Palitoy. So, there was obviously a lot more ideas being developed than what we got as final product. So as a designer myself, I love getting those kind of insights into the creative process. They were literally making full use of whatever they had at their disposal. And as Paddy mentioned there, at that time, Palitoy owned Airfix. So they would have had access to all the Airfix tooling. So had they been able to, get it approved by sales and marketing to develop some of these vehicles, a lot of the initial kind of design and tooling work would have been done with these kind of base kits that were already in their portfolio.
Yeah, and it's not unusual for Palitoy to use pieces from other toy lines in Action Force either. The Satellite Defense obviously uses part of the Millennium Falcon. There's like a dish-shaped oval on the underside, which is just the Millennium Falcon's satellite dish. And obviously they use a lot of Star Wars weaponry packed in with Action Force figures. You had Han Solo's blaster coming with Baron Ironblood, for example.
With Series 2 now kind of developed and ready to go, in 1983, they brought it to market. And this is a photo of one of the sort of in-store, what an in-store display could look like. I don't think this is part of an actual, shop. I think this is more just a setup in the Palitoy studios of what it could look like.
Yeah.
So we have the great, the big Baron Ironblood kind of cut out, how the price tags could be positioned, the leaflet giveaway kind of standee there in the middle of all of that, the poster. So they had a whole series of kind of point of sale pieces developed, so that when they went to market, they'd really be able to visually support this at point of sale.
And it's interesting to see the recommended retail prices there as well on those items. So you're talking £1.59 for a figure. I think it's $6.99 there for the Jeep.
Yeah.
$3.99 for the flak cannon. And then what's that there? How much is that Hawk going for? I think that's $6.99 as well, is it? The SAS. $6.49 on the Hawk. So there you go. That was the prices at the time, which is a nice way of finding out what the prices were at the time as well.
I mean, I should call out, this is probably point of sale material developed for 1984, because we can see the Robo Skull in some of the pieces there, and of course the Hawk itself was also a
was also year
release.
2, yeah.
But still a lovely piece of history there that we uncovered in our research to show that sort of approach to point of sale. And this kind of leads us then into the rise of kind of Battle Action Force. So we'll call this first part, who needs a comic? And that marketing strategy that Palitoy envisaged for Action Force coming into 1983 was that they would have sort of a 3-pronged approach. And the first would be TV commercials. The second would be the fan club. And the third would be a comic tie-in. And the comic tie-in was absolutely essential in their kind of marketing strategy. It wasn't just a simple kind of, afterthought. It was key, absolutely key to the overall strategy. So kind of to give a little bit of history of Palitoy's kind of, tie-ins with kind of comics and novels, it's something they'd done very successfully with Action Man in the 1970s. They would have had an annual for Action Man, kind of novel tie-ins, and of course the sticker books, where the stickers would form like panels in a comic, and you could read the captions to get a complete story, with Action Man as the key hero. So they had that track record in kind of developing comics, and then even internally at Palitoy, they would create these lovely kind of one-pager comic inserts, which they would include with some of the vehicles. And on the left here, you see kind of a comic strip illustrated by Greg Hughes, one of the Palitoy designers, which features the Action Man helicopter. And then the large image here is for the AF5 vehicle. So that would have been folded up and included with the AF5 Action Force AF5 vehicle. And again, you get this one-pager kind of comic panel. So Palitoy were no strangers to doing, let's say, content marketing to promote their toys and to help kind of fire imaginations. But obviously we know that, in 1982, Real American Hero comic for G.I. Joe was released in the United States. So kind of it's not unusual to think that maybe Hasbro suggested to Palitoy that they take the comic thing more seriously, or maybe Palitoy could see how successful the comic was for Hasbro, and maybe they wanted to up their game a little bit. We don't know, is the bottom line, but there is a bit of a history there to show that that Palitoy could have got to the comic tie-in on their own because of their success with Action Man in the past. But what is curious is that the very first partner that Palitoy looked at for a comic tie-in was Marvel UK. And that might kind of lead you to think that, well, G.I. Joe's like Marvel in the USA, Palitoy are looking at Marvel in the UK. Maybe they're taking a bit of inspiration from from Hasbro. And we see this is a mock-up that was developed by the artist John Higgins, a legend of the British and American comic scene. And he sketched this up as a mock-up for what a cover could look like for a first issue, and what the character of Baron Ironblood would look like, which is obviously based on that early prototype of Baron Ironblood that we looked at a little bit earlier. So again, this is all still happening in 1982. They're trying to work out, how they're going to do the comic tie-in.
So Brian, I might just interject there for our American listeners. John Higgins worked on Watchmen. And we should also mention that we met John Higgins about 6 weeks ago at the Enniskillen Comic Fest.
Yes.
And we got him to sign our copies of Total Action Force: The Battle Years because we pointed out to him the artwork, obviously, he had done for this mock-up. And this is one of the images, obviously, the Baron Ironblood. But he also did concept sketches for who was clearly Quarrel, and also Sniper from Special Weapons Force. So at the time, obviously, that Palitoy approached Marvel UK and asked them to help develop the comic. Obviously, Quarrel was going to be a main character, and Sniper from Special Weapons Force was going to be a main character. So I think it's quite funny that a character who would go on to become famously unreleased and unknown was going to be one of the main characters in this Marvel UK Action Force comic. The writer initially tapped to write this comic, incidentally, was Alan Moore.
Yes.
On behalf of Marvel UK. So there's an alternative universe out there where possibly Britain's greatest living comics writer wrote a shitty toy tie-in.
Well,
if it was him writing
it probably would have been shitty. And of course, obviously, Battle Action Force is not shitty, but it'd be a very different universe where you had the creator of V for Vendetta and Watchmen and the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen having one of his first works in comics professionally being a Palitoy Action Force tie-in. I do find that quite funny. But so it's interesting to see, even at this late stage where they were planning a comic to coincide with the launch of the toy line, they're still using concepts that would not make it to market in the end. Obviously, this Baron Ironblood design is quite clearly, but also, like I said, Special Weapons Force team were being discussed as being stars of the comic, even months before the toy line would launch.
There's a parallel there, actually, to the American Marvel involvement in the development of the G.I. Joe comic and toys, where before the comic launched, Herb Trimpe was working on preliminary character designs, which is sort of evolved before the first comic came out, and saw some of the characters looking quite different, like maskless Snake Eyes, for example. And they also were involved in the development of sort of the preliminary sort of marker sketches to kind of illustrate what the front cover might look like in that similar sort of marker style.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, and actually, I was pleasantly surprised that John Higgins remembered working on this as well. He's like, as soon as he saw the art, he's like, "Oh yeah, I did do that."
Yeah.
That was what I wanted to ask. Yeah, did he have any recollection at all? And
he did. He remembered it. He remembered. He was like, "Oh yes, I remember working on this."
He was interviewed by David MacDonald for Total Action Force: The Battle Years. So when we cover this in the book, there's actually first-hand. We get John Higgins' first-hand account of working on this. And at the time, he wasn't even full-time in comics. It was something he was doing. We had a day job, and he was doing the likes of this stuff, in weekends and evenings. So as I was kind of saying there, before we kind of segued a little bit there, I was saying, about, possibly Palitoy took a bit of inspiration from what Hasbro were doing with G.I. Joe Real American Hero with the comic. But again, there is some evidence there to suggest that Palitoy could have arrived at the whole comic tie-in on their own. And we can see here, these are ads that Palitoy commissioned that were run in Star Wars Weekly, which was published by Marvel UK. And these were illustrated by Brian Boland and were a big departure from the typical kind of product ads that Palitoy had done previously. They're much more dynamic.
Isn't that image of the TIE Fighter and X-Wing like one of the best pieces of Star Wars art you've ever seen?
It's just beautiful.
Like the dynamism in that piece. Like the TIE Fighter has literally never looked as good, I don't think. And obviously, as Brian mentioned, it's Brian Boland doing these pieces. Brian Boland who went on to draw Batman: The Killing Joke and become one of the most in-demand, probably, cover artists for comics since that day.
Which John Higgins also coloured.
That's right. He coloured The Killing Joke. That's right. So yeah, a lot of very famous artists working on Palitoy related stuff back in the day.
So I suppose what this shows is that Palitoy had a track record in content marketing, developing comic style products to promote their own toy products, and they had a relationship with Marvel UK, certainly from an advertising perspective, which would have been very lucrative for Palitoy with their Star Wars toy line. But myself and Paddy learned recently from interviewing Carol Dayton, who was the head of Monroe Dayton PR, that handled the PR for Action Force. She explained to us that really somebody on the Monroe Dayton side had connections with IPC Comics. So, and they traded as Fleetway. And Fleetway had a much bigger distribution in Marvel UK. Their turnover weekly for their titles was in the tens of thousands. Some of them were even up to over 100,000 issues per week. So Monroe Dayton steered Palitoy in the direction of IPC or Fleetway.
We should also probably mention that Marvel UK at the time had never done original content for the UK market. They were a reprint publishing house only. So they were just reprinting and repackaging existing Marvel comics for the UK market. So had Action Force gone to Marvel UK, it would have been Marvel UK's first original series.
And whereas, Fleetway, by comparison, only produced original material. That was what they were famous for. And this little graphic here, this is lifted out of Total Action Force: The Battle Years. And we can see that the comic Battle, which was, if you like, Fleetway's war comic, in 1979, it had sales per week of 120,000 issues, in excess of 120,000 issues. And we can see that slowly declining as we come up to January 1983, where it's kind of at a low, in the sort of the high 70s, about 77,000 per week sales. And it's at this point that Action Force, in the summer of 1983, Action Force gets its debut in Battle. And we're going to, so before we kind of get into the actual comic itself, we'll do a little introduction to the team. And there he is, the man himself, Jerry Finley Day. I mean, just to give a very brief kind of history, a very brief history on Jerry. by 1983, Jerry has an amazing track record behind him in the comics industry. Prior to comics, he was a paratrooper, so he had a military background. When he came into comics, he's initially worked on some of the kind of girls' comics before moving into the boys' comics field. He was brought on board to really develop a whole series of different titles for Battle when that comic was released in the 1970s. And he created characters such as the Sarge, Hellman of Hammer Force, which is a brilliant anti-hero story. And then he even worked with 2000 AD, the science fiction title that IPC had out to create strips like the VCs. And of course, he's most famous for Rogue Trooper, his kind of anti-war, future war saga. But because the ambition for the Action Force comics was so massive, IPC had to put a serious team together to produce some incredible stories. And Jerry was brought on board as the lead writer to take that sort of maybe an kind of groundwork that Palitoy's design and marketing team had put together for the various characters and to turn that into an exciting and a dynamic and dramatic comics universe. But of course, he wasn't working, in isolation. Working with him was Jim Watson, one of the artists on the visual side of the team. Cam Kennedy, another comics legend, who's probably very famous for his Star Wars Dark Empire work. And of course, the mighty John Cooper, who is a workhorse of the kind of comics, the British comics industry. So we have this team of seasoned veterans assembled to bring Action Force to life. And of course, other creatives included the young James Tomlinson, who was only new to the field as a supporting writer, and also Scott Goodall, another seasoned comics writer as well in there, and the Vanyo brothers, again on the art side, who would go on to do some of the best strips in Action Force. And when it made its debut in June 1983, almost exactly a year after G.I. Joe made its debut in comic form, this is the front cover, illustrated by Jim Watson, and it features Baron Ironblood unmasked, one of the very rare times we actually see an unmasked Baron Ironblood in the comics. And that was followed up, that initial story that was serialized in 4 issues was followed up by a series of 5 mini-comics, which were released, they were given away free with the Battle comic over kind of 2 weekly intervals, or 2 weeks between each mini comics release. But then as we get into, before we even get to that, just wanted to show that this is one of the panels from the comic, which features a prototype space station that was developed for for what looks like a point-of-sale piece. So even at this early stage of the comics, when these were being illustrated, Jim Watson his reference material was all still pretty much prototype based. And then by October 1983, Action Force becomes a permanent fixture within the pages of Battle, and the comic is rebranded as Battle Action Force. And half the comic is given over now to Action Force strips. One of the kind of the flagship stories that kind of kicked this off was Operation Bloodhound, which pits SAS Force against Baron Ironblood and the Red Shadows. And here's a nice, again, point-of-sale piece that was developed to help promote this kind of the rebranded title. And we can see that some of it was given away as a free comic, even in some stores. So there was a huge marketing push put behind this kind of rebranded Battle. And of course, if we look back at that sales chart that we showed a few slides ago, we could see the sales for Battle start to creep back up again with that kind of union with Action Force.
And it makes sense that they'd want to have a big focus on the sort of SAS guys as well there on that front cover, because they were almost like superheroes, weren't
Yes.
they, of the day?
Yeah,
following,
and
like, the
and the SAS figures had been the biggest Action Man sellers as well at that time. So when they were developing Action Force, they knew they had to get the SAS in there because the 12-inch Action Man SAS troopers were flying off the shelves, and you can see that even well into the 1980s as Action Man was ramping down, the SAS were still a huge component of the toy line up until it was cancelled.
Well, and here's an interesting thing about the SAS, which Jerry Finley Day has written an introduction for Volume 1. And here's a little exclusive reveal here on Talking Joe. In his introduction, he mentions specifically about the SAS. And prior to the Iranian embassy, nobody knew who the SAS were. And he had a brother in the SAS. And after the Iranian embassy was siege was broadcast all over TV, Jerry's brother informed him that there was a huge, like a massive influx of new recruits to join the SAS, a unit that nobody had ever heard of prior to that famously televised siege. I suppose where we're coming to now at this stage is, sticking with the comics here, is to do a couple of quick character case studies. And this is, I suppose, to contrast what Palitoy kind of produced as part of their kind of background development for the characters, and then how that translated over into the comics. And here's Red Laser. Red Laser is probably well known for being the kind of a Cobra Commander repaint. But back in 1983, we didn't know anything about Cobra Commander on this side of the Atlantic. And we just knew Red Laser was this, he was, a kind of a scientist who specialized in laser dynamics. And we can see from his file card, which was included on the pack, the outside of the pack of the laser exterminator, that he's a kind of a Japanese terrorist and a former kind of technology student, who joins the Red Shadows. But when Jerry Finley Day gets his hands on him, he becomes a little bit more fleshed out. And what we see here is that he has this Jerry, still it keeps all that kind of, his kind of scientific nature, that kind of technology, laser technology, that's all still very much part of the character. But Jerry introduces a lot of kind of the Japanese historical martial weapons in there, such as the longbow, the shuriken, and even, the stories where he uses the katana as well. So it becomes a much more developed character in the comics universe. And then we have Red Jackal. Again, another, kind of G.I. Joe sort of repaint. But again, for us as kids in 1983, this was all Palitoy products. And we have this guy, Anton Novikov, who is ambushed by Red Shadows, and then they bionically re-engineer him to kind of bring him back as a member of the Red Shadows team. But when Jerry gets his hands on him, we get a little bit more detail on the character. Red Laser is one of the scientists who helps, heal his injuries so that he can be bionically re-engineered. Looks like he's the character in Jerry's universe is kind of modeled on a mix of kind of RoboCop and Terminator. And this guy, all he is a ruthless killer who drives a tank. There's not much more to him than that, but that kind of savagery and brutality behind the character, Jerry brings that out to great effect in the comics.
When we were at JoeFest, I just pointed out this panel here on the right hand side of the screen. It's like there's not very many comics that you'll see somebody drive a tank into the UN and machine gun all the delegates.
No, it's
you wouldn't see that in G.I. Joe that often, and there is a really big difference in tone between Battle Action Force and G.I. Joe. I think I know. I was talking to Travis from A Toy Kind of Mood, at JoeFest, and I was taking him through the mock-ups that we had at the show, and I was saying to him, you didn't see people die in GI Joe that often. Occasionally you get a Saw Viper taking out another squad of Joes, but in Battle Action Force it's almost a weekly occurrence. I think I showed him the mock-up of Desert Strike, where obviously Z Force are getting absolutely pummeled by a Harrier jump jet. And there's a piece where you see a bunch of Z Force flak cannons, attack cannons, getting taken out. And Travis is just like, you would never see that in G.I. Joe, where like one of the G.I. Joe vehicles is just absolutely annihilated.
Yeah, it's well, Battle, when it was originated in the 1970s, it had a reputation for being, really graphic, and it wasn't going to pull its punches when it came to the drama and the violence within its stories. In fact, I was on the Full Force earlier this week having the same conversation with Chris, and we talked about the comic Action that Fleetway put out in the 1970s, which was banned after only a few issues because of the violence that was being depicted on the front covers. So that's the kind of the heritage that Battle had, and that all got applied to the Action Force universe. And characters like Red Jackal really allowed them to just, go crazy with the dramatic action scenes.
And the like the heritage of the war comics as well, sort of very very akin to what's going on in Action Force, and it would be like the Brits versus the Germans or whatever, and it'd be like, take this Bosch, get the Fritz.
Battle transition to having commandos knifing Nazis in the face to having Z Force knifing Red Shadows in the face. It was pretty seamless, actually.
So, and of course, this brings us kind of full circle to to today. We've got the return of Battle Action Force. Total Toy Books have been very lucky to work with Rebellion and Skeletron to bring the Battle Action Force Treasury editions, back into print, and the 3 volumes that you see up here on screen captured the stories from 1983 through to 1984, which followed the main continuity that was developed by Jerry Finley Day. So he's the lead writer on the stories of these, but there are stories from James Tomlinson and Scott Goodall included in here. And right now, people can pre-order all 3 volumes for the price of just 2 if you go to totaltoybooks.com.
So we talked about it being a pre-order with the early bundle deal. So what does that mean in terms of when, I guess, the question that a lot of people have been asking, and we now know the answer to, when does this early bird bundle finish?
The closing date to get to pre-order at the early bird price is midnight on the 17th of August. And that's midnight Pacific time. So for our kind of viewers in the United States, that's midnight West Coast time on August 17th.
Which is about, it would be 8 a.m. in the morning for us in the UK. So 8 a.m. in the morning of the 18th for us in European time.
So there's still a few weeks there. Now people will still be able to pre-order after that date, but that 3-for-2 deal won't be on the table anymore after that.
So I think you quoted in euros quite a lot, because that's your home currency. For the Brits and the United States audience, what that kind of translates?
It's about 60. So I think it's. I have to do it's about 100 and. For the 3-for-2 deal, it's roughly £125 for all 3 books, and on the United States side, it's about $160 for all 3. Now, it is worth remembering that these books are big. Let me, in fact, grab one over here. These are massive. I can't even. Well, I got to lean right back to finish. So these are really big books. They're pretty heavy as well. They contain 272 pages, and they have a beautiful kind of lay flat binding. So that means that images that spread across the gutter, they won't get lost in the gutter. And it's printed on beautiful wood-free, uncoated paper, so it'll have that similar kind of look and texture to how they were printed originally. But obviously, it's a type of paper that's that will last. It's not newsprint.
Yeah, I mean, because the issue with the books as printed, that even if you bought them in the day and you've got them in your collection, if you've read them and they've been exposed to the air and things like that, there's basically no copies that exist anymore that are in mint condition, because these aren't, they're not printed on an archival paper.
Not exactly true, because Bob Braken sent Brian a box of his comics that he had gotten back in the day as comps that he had never looked at, and they had been sealed away in his attic for 40 years. So if you remember, we were giving away posters at JoeFest using some of the Action Force art, and the Roboskull versus Wolverine print we were giving away was actually Bob's Roboskull versus Wolverine piece of artwork that Brian scanned, because it was in perfect condition. You had sent me some images of Bob's comics and that pull-out poster, and I was like, we have to do that as a print for JoeFest, because it was in such good condition. You just never saw the artwork in such a good condition before. And it was because Bob had them sealed away in plastic for 40 years, never to be opened. Bob isn't a fan of Battle Action Force, because Jerry took some liberties with Bob's ideas for the characters, and so Bob wouldn't read it. Bob was particularly upset at Jerry's treatment of the Kraken.
But I'll just let me clarify a couple of things there. The poster that Paddy's referring to is obviously printed on a different kind of paper that the comic was printed on. So the poster is that kind of glossy poster paper holds up better over time. But the newsprint, no matter how you try and store it, if it's not in a perfectly climate controlled environment, it will degrade no matter what. So obviously, the new books being printed is on a much higher grade quality paper. But the second point there as well about the treatment of the Kraken, that's a James Tomlinson story, not a Jerry Finley story.
Is it? Okay. Apologies for that.
James, what I love about James Tomlinson, just to kind of sidetrack a little bit, he's the young writer in the room. He's the 19-year-old guy. It's his first professional gig, and he has a real penchant for horror. So that Codename Kraken story, it's a horror story. It's like a classic Hammer House of horror. If they were to make, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee were to make Battle Action Force stories, Codename Kraken is what we would get. Yes, it did take quite a few liberties with the Kraken's kind of backstory.
But Bob's ideas. Actually, it's funny because obviously James Tomlinson was a fan of Action Force as well.
Yes.
Like he was genuinely a fan of it that got to work on it, which I found is very, very interesting.
And he got to work on it with a little bit of help because his dad was
Barry Tomlinson.
The editor.
Nothing like a bit of nepotism. Obviously, he called himself Nichols as his pen name, so that they wouldn't know that it was his dad who hired him. But it was.
But to be fair to James, he did carve out a fantastic career for himself as a comics writer, and he specialized.
To be fair, he did the work. He wrote, was it one of the newspaper strips for one of the British newspapers for a long time.
That's right. And he also worked on licensed properties such as Mask, the Matchbox Ring Raiders, with Ian Kennedy on art duties. Fantastic collaboration there. I think he even worked on Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. So
that's right, yeah.
As opposed to Ninja Turtles. So he had a fantastic kind of comics career.
Weren't we talking to somebody at Enniskillen who was a big fan of Sonic the Comic from
Yeah,
Fleetway?
yeah,
And they were very surprised to see all the crossover between Sonic the Comic and Action Force,
yeah.
because a lot of the writers and artists, and you may not know this, Mark. So the Fleetway Sonic the Comic is considered like the best Sonic the Hedgehog lore. And similar to Action Force, the reprint rights have been locked away behind closed doors for close on to 40 years. And there's been kind of a campaign to try get those Fleetway Sonic comics reprinted, because a lot of the foundational lore for Sonic the Hedgehog is from those comics.
Mick McMunn, famous 2000 AD artist.
Yeah.
Did a lot of Sonic the Hedgehog. That's right. Yeah.
Very strange, from Judge Dredd to Sonic the Comic.
But yeah, this particular person had brought like a pile of Fleetway Sonic the Comics to get Nick McMahon to sign them, because he was at Enniskillen too.
Good segue though. This material has been locked away, essentially, in terms of official outlets for it, for 40 years. I guess 40 plus years now. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came together, like the kind of the legal tangle that this material kind of got itself into, and how you untangled it?
Well, it has its origins in the Total Action Force, the battle years, when we were developing that. The vision we had for that book, that needed to tell the story of the people behind Action Force, not just the story of the toys and the comics itself. So we wanted to focus in on the individuals, the writers, the designers, on all sides of that. But then to be able to illustrate that story, we had access to the toys here, so we knew we could photograph them, we could get the toys included. But to do it right, we needed to get the comic artwork featured in that book as well. So anyone who's already bought that book or is familiar with that book will know there's loads of comic artwork, shown in that book, like a lot, like more than, it must be something like over 100 panels or something get featured in, throughout the book. It's a lot, So the only way we were ever going to be able to do that would be with permission. And that started kind of a dialogue with Rebellion and with Hasbro to kind of to secure the various permissions on that, which we got all those in place. And that, with that relationship established, then that carried over into Total Action Force Volume 2. And then it was kind of a logical progression then, was to try and get those permissions extended and get a new license to reprint the Action Force comics. So where we are right now today is that we have that license in place, and we've got these, the first kind of outing here are these 3 volumes which cover the 83 to 84 stories. So that's essentially on the Action Force comics timeline. That is all of the continuity right up to the point just before Baron Ironblood decides to reinvent himself as Cobra Commander. Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert for a 40-year-old comic.
So it really focuses in on that Palitoy era. So the bad guys are the Red Shadows. The good guys are the Z Force, SAS Force, Q Force, and Space Force. The unique Palitoy teams. That's the content. That's the continuity, and you get a complete account of the mythology right up to that final mission before the events of World Enemy Number 1 kick in. It follows the Jerry Finley Days kind of primary continuity, so it doesn't include origin stories, even though Jerry and Scott Goodall and James Tomlinson all worked on different origin stories in that same 83-84 period. They're not included in this run unless they somehow kind of tie into the continuity. So Red Jackal is an origin story, but it's essential to the Red Shadows lore, so that is included. Similarly with Codename Kraken, that's essential to the Red Shadows lore because it places them in Europe at a particular point on the timeline, which ties in with other stories around there. So that has to be included. But something like, say, the epic Black Major origin story, which is it's a Jerry Finley Dane masterpiece, which describes how a bad guy becomes an even badder guy over the course of his career. But it doesn't fit with the chronology that we're trying to tell in these 3 volumes. So if you're somebody new to Action Force and you get your hands on these 3 volumes and you start on page 1 on volume 1 and you read through to page 272 on volume 3, you've got this nice linear chronology that takes you through how the universe is developed and maybe why it gives you nearly a rationale as to why Baron Ironblood would consider kind of, changing tactic and reinventing himself.
Yeah, because sort of Battle Action Force comes from this tradition of like the British anthology, I guess, where you've got just a handful of pages of a particular story alongside multiple other stories, and because they're weekly, you'll get your little burst of a particular story, and it'll be continued 7 days time when possibly you might go down to the newsagent to buy it, or maybe you've got like a standing order with your newsagents. Your American audience would be like your local chemist,
Your local drugstore, maybe, yeah.
Your drugstore, yeah. But they would sort of scrawl your house number in the corner of the book,
Yeah.
and shove it through your letterbox so that you had it the day it comes out. Yeah, sort of regular weekly burst of story, reading these multiple sort of continuing threads across. So it means that when you're sort of you're holding them all in your head weekly as you're kind of consuming them as they're coming out, but then going back to read them as a sweep, it kind of makes more sense to have a whole story telling like a beginning to end, and not having it kind of interrupted by all of these other unrelated things.
I love that you brought that up, Mark, because that actually that's a really important point. That we can take these stories which were serialized with. For some stories they were in 3 pages a week. Others, the more the flagship stories, in the center spread, they got 4 pages. And when they refined the format a little bit in kind of 1984, the hero story was getting 6 pages. But you still had side stories only getting 3 pages. So being able to bring those stories together and read them in a continuous flow in volumes like these is, I think it's going to be great for readers. To get that unbroken kind of narrative, and then how each story can kind of, pushes the next one, or sets up the next story that springboards off from that.
Touched on as well that another kind of feature of these British stories is often you would get the double page spread, and that would be the splash of color for that particular week. It might just like be the center pages that would be color and the rest black and white. And talking about flat open book, that is so important for being able to really take in those stories. And not have that middle section lost in the gutter. So yeah, do you want to talk a little about that, and also the use of color in your reprint?
Sure. So, well, on the binding side of it, that's called lay flat binding, which it's not a perfect join because of the way books are bound. It's not there is a seam, but with typical binding, the gutter, as a designer, you're allowing for about 10 to 15 millimeters of page that you're going to lose in the gutter with typical binding solutions. But with the lay flat solution, that only comes down to a couple of millimeters. So, we'll get a nice clear, we won't lose any, or we won't lose too much information in that gutter. It'll be about a millimeter of image is all. So it won't negatively impact kind of the reading experience for the reader. And for me, as someone who, as a visual designer, I want that artwork to stand out loud and proud and be displayed as beautifully as possible. So I don't want to see any of that kind of being lost in the gutter. So for me, that was kind of, it was a personal choice. Just for I want to have those uninterrupted color spreads. And if that works for everybody else, happy days. But
And it's one of those things where it's been 40 years to get Hasbro to agree to this, because we are not. This is not the first time Rebellion have tried to get the rights to reprint this stuff. They tried themselves a few years ago, just didn't get anywhere with Hasbro. So this may not happen again, because it has always been kind of tough to get the sign off from Hasbro for our books. Varying degrees of toughness. We could tell you stories that I won't publicize, but catch me at JoeFest next year and we'll talk. And as I said, Rebellion tried themselves a few years ago to talk to Hasbro to get the rights to reprint this stuff, because obviously they own it. They paid money for it when they were buying the back catalogs of IPC, and they wanted to use it. And so when this opportunity came up, I think it was important to present it as well as could be done, because you're probably not going to get soft covers of these books. You're probably not going to get digital versions, because our license is just for the hardcovers.
There won't be any kind of digital versions of this. It is just the hardcover format.
Yeah,
but
and that's the way Hasbro are with things now. Is they want particular projects being done, and they want things to look as good as they can, and they want things to be they want, when they're licensing a book or something, they want high quality, and they want something that looks really good on the bookshelf. I mean, a good example is probably Carson's book, where Hasbro saw what he wanted to do and they gave him a license because they knew it would be a quality product. And that is what they're looking for. They're looking for really big, splashy looking projects, which is why, what has been approved.
Just coming back to Mark, you were talking about the color spreads and then how they would kind of interchange between color and black and white in the comics. So again, people who grew up with the British comics are already familiar with this. So, but if you're, maybe on the American side of the Atlantic, and British comics is kind of something you're only discovering, those comics were for the most part printed in black and white, but with the cover, the front and back cover would be in full color, and then the center spread would be in full color as well. So what that would mean is, say, for a story that is a flagship story, that would get the center spread because it was full color, but then when you turn the page, the next two pages would be black and white. So you do that, get that interchange of color and black and white as you read through the book, which is not unlike, say, modern kind of anime comics, where there's kind of transitions between kind of color or grayscale and then hard black and white as you're kind of reading through those. But I suppose that's kind of the logic from the production side of how those comics are produced. And of course, in our books now, and in these books that are coming out, everything is reproduced as faithfully as possible to the original publication. So if it was color in its original format, it's color in this book. If it was black and white in the original format, it's black and white in this book. So it's trying to keep the reproduction as faithful as possible to how things would have been originally printed.
How about covers? How are you approaching?
Well, for sometimes the cover was actually, say, the first page of the story in a particular weekly release. So you might have a cover, say, with, it could be, there's a famous cover with Quarrel on the rapid fire motorcycle, and she's being shot by a sniper. And the actual, there's this kind of a speech bubble, and there's on the front cover, and then when you turn the page 2 just continues the story on from there. So in a scenario like that, the cover sits in with the story pages to keep that kind of linear narrative flow. But obviously we've got some fantastic covers for Action Force that aren't part of the narrative story. They were just beautiful covers to kind of just promote, just to fight for a kid's attentions when it was on the shelf. So those covers are collected in a cover gallery, and there'll be a small cover gallery in each volume, with covers that are kind of related to the stories from that particular time frame.
This, I guess we're used to pre-orders and we're used to needing to be very patient. What can we expect in terms of an actual release in hand date for these?
We'll have physical copies in hand in December. So shipping will begin kind of mid-December to our anyone who's pre-ordered. So if I just break that down, maybe a little bit more kind of detail. So Skeletron is a major stakeholder and project partner with Total Toy Books, and Skeletron's going to handle the North American fulfillment, and then all of the Irish, British, European fulfillment will happen from our fulfillment company here in Ireland. So what that means is that realistically, our Irish, British, and European pre-order customers, they'll probably get their books maybe a week or two prior to our North American customers, but they will, late December, early January, our American books will be arriving into people's homes in America and Canada.
But even more importantly, American customers aren't having to pay over the odds for a shipping rate because they're getting an American rate shipping America to America rather from Europe.
Exactly. Paying an American rate. So to get all 3 volumes shipped, which is about £15, £16 when it's packed, that is, I'm just working it out in my head here. It's €25, so that's about maybe $30.
It's about $28. But $28 is, I think it's 110 is the exchange rate at the moment. So yeah, about $28, $29.
And then for people in the UK, if you that will be shipped from Ireland. So it'll be about 16. It's about €16. So I don't know what that is in pounds. Again, that's for all 3 books. So that's probably about £12, £13, something like that. So we've managed to negotiate really good shipping rates, and obviously with Skeletron's help in North America, it means we can get those books out to our American backers. It'll take a little bit of time to get those books across the water and through customs on the American side into the fulfillment center in the United States. So that's why there'd be a week or two delay for American customers getting their books.
Yeah, and we should clarify they're being printed in Europe by Rebellion's printer that they use to print their own books. So if you're familiar with what Rebellion do in terms of their trade paperbacks, in terms of their Treasury editions, that's the same kind of print quality you can expect.
This project is all about the quality, both in terms of the reproduction of the graphics and the actual presentation from a printing perspective. It's absolutely key. So we're looking forward to, again, towards the end of this year, getting the books in hand, seeing our customers get the books in hand, and and hoping that people are going to really enjoy this important part of kind of preserving the legacy of Battle Action Force.
And I should mention that the size of the books, they fit perfectly in one of these calyx shelves, like they're built for them. But that might give you an idea of how kind of tall they are. They just fit perfectly in one of these.
It's snug.
One of these, it's snug in terms of height for a calyx shelf. So so they should if you've got a Billy bookcase from IKEA, they should fit in there snug as a bug.
Yeah, we sort of touched on the actual comics themselves, and I guess the book, each volume is divided up into kind of 3 epics plus surrounding content, I guess. Is that fair to kind of describe it?
I would say volume 1 is called Red Tide Rising, and that really is, it focuses on Baron Ironblood and the Red Shadows. And while, all the Action Force teams kind of get a feature in there, it's principally a Red Shadows kind of book or focus book. So if you're a big fan of the Red Shadows and you've only got the budget for 1 book, Red Tide Rising is the book for you. The second volume is called World in Peril, and that it really lets the other Action Force teams kind of get a look in. So you've got your Q Force, your Space Force, SAS Force and Z Force really did get most of the page time in battle. So they do feature much more prominently than the other Action Force teams. So World in Peril is maybe a good kind of all-rounder. If you like, all the different factions, including the enemy, World in Peril is a great all-rounder. And it gives you that great codename Kraken, that James Tomlinson kind of sci-fi horror masterpiece. And then Volume 3 is, there he is. And then Volume 3 is the Z-Force trilogy. And that really, it takes 3 epic Z-Force stories written by Jerry Finley-Day and illustrated by Vanyo, all of them. So you have that consistency in writer and artist combo. It focuses on Z-Force, and Volume 3 is called Axis of Evil because it sees Z-Force scope against 3 different types of enemy in the course of their adventures. And likewise, that Z-Force volume kicks off in October 1983 and goes right through to the end of 1984. Again, and wraps up prior to the events of World Enemy Number 1. So it's that in and of itself has got its own kind of linear timeline that spans the full 2 years. It really is a superb book. So if Z-Force is your thing, Volume 3 is the book that you want to get your hands on.
And if you're kind of an really into the art and the look of the thing, I think for me, Vanyo is it is the high watermark. The Vanyo brothers it's stunning, it's detailed, it's dynamic. There isn't enough superlatives to describe their art, and an entire volume of just Vanyo art is that
Well,
is,
it's funny. We first discussed this, Brian. It must be nearly 6 years ago now, and it was just after we'd gotten Hasbro's permission to do Volume 2. So how long ago was that? That's a long time ago. And we were driving. I think we were driving down to an event somewhere, and you said your dream would be to collect those Vanyo stories.
Yes.
The Vanyo Z-Force stories in a volume. You said it was top of your priority list of what you wanted to do in the future if we had a chance. If we got more cooperation from Hasbro, and now you're getting to do it. So dreams do come true. But I remember distinctly you saying that your dream would be to get a book of those stories out there.
But just like you, Mark, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Vanyo, and I love all the artists that worked on Battle Action Force, and you have to give credit to the other brilliant artists like John Cooper is incredible. Jim Watson, his magnificent kind of brushstroke work, it would just really suits the kind of the violent nature of the stories. But Vanyo was the artist that I loved as a kid. Today, I'm still a massive fan of the work of the Vanyo brothers, not just in Action Force, but in the other titles that they worked on as well. I mean, they really are just magnificent. And of course, Jerry Finley-Day writes all 3 of those stories. So he's everybody. I'm always talking about Jerry Finley-Day when I get on any of these kind of interviews and podcasts. My fanboy flag is flying loud and proud.
It was very funny. You were having a conversation with Ben from RoboSkull, and Ben is like, "Who is this guy you're talking about?" Because obviously Jerry is a big enough name for 2000 AD fans would know who Jerry is, obviously, and the Americans just don't know who he is. Even though Rogue Trooper has been reprinted in the States a few times, like IDW, I know did a series of trades of it, but he hasn't got into the consciousness of American comics fans at all.
We're changing that. We are going to change.
We're changing that today.
Just one other thing on Volume 3, just to flag as well, is that within the Action Force comic, you got all these great kind of one-pager pieces, such as Combat Files, which was a beautiful piece of art, and then a kind of maybe a 200-word essay describing the events that were happening in that piece. A lot of those art pieces were done by Spanish artists, which included Carmona and the other Romero. Jose Romero and Jose Carmona worked on those Combat Files. So those Combat Files are going to be collected in the Volume 3 book as well. So that'll be a nice addition in there.
Yeah, nice extra great content. Message there from Simon, who was with us in the
I'm
States
very
at
jealous of his.
JoeFest.
I'm very jealous of his Iron Grenadiers Destro sketching out from Mark Pennington. That was a nice piece of work.
Superb. And he says, "Evening, gents. Can't wait to get my copies. Will there be special white gloves to handle the books? I'm ready."
Get your own gloves, Simon.
But yeah, I mean, your hands back in the day would definitely damage, the comics, and the newsprint would be, if you'd been having a good read,
Oh yeah.
the newsprint would be left on your hand. And if you had I don't know if you ever did this. There was a thing back in the 80s called silly putty, which was like this sort of rubberized flubber thing, and you could roll it on stamp it on a piece of newsprint and take it away, and it would be like
back in Ireland. It was called Mola in Ireland.
Mola, okay.
Mola. I don't know why we called it that. It was always we called it, but it's similar, very similar silly putty.
Daz Blue, they're pointing out that Iron Blood and the Red Shadows best villains, better than Cobra. Do you have a favorite? Do you have a preference? Do you guys?
Just following up on Daz's comment there, the readers of Battle Action Force hated it too, because that graph Brian showed you earlier on, where you see it kind of peaks and then it immediately drops off a cliff. That's when Cobra Commander's introduced. that story arc shaved about 5,000 or 6,000 weekly copies off the sales of that comic.
But I mean, it was definitely a change for the readers. But when you look at how skillfully Jerry Finley Day retconned in Cobra Commander, because, well, just for some context for people who aren't familiar with the toy history, Palitoy's design department closed down in 1984, so they weren't producing any new toys. And then Palitoy leaned into that license with Hasbro to bring more G.I. Joe product into their toy line throughout 1985 and 86. So with that, in fact, it became almost entirely G.I. Joe product that Palitoy were putting out. So the comics had to, get on board with that. And the way Jerry kind of weaves that into the mythology is it is a masterpiece. And that story, World Enemy Number 1, myself and Chris did a Disorder of Battle kind of talk through of that story, which is up on the Full Force YouTube channel. And it's a brilliant story of how this bad guy, who's pretty much, he's just been defeated too many times, his back's against the wall, and how he kind of turns it all around. And when he comes out of it, Cobra are much more formidable than the Red Shadows ever were. And the tone in the comics gets a lot darker. So if it wasn't violent enough for you with the Red Shadows, Cobra ups it a notch. With their particular kind of campaigns kind of terror around the globe. Now, I'm not disagreeing with Daz there and his comment, but, being in the community on the comic side, we get a lot of, there's fans who love the Cobra era of Action Force, and then there's those that much prefer the Red Shadows era. I'm in that kind of middle group where I love both, so.
It's in, and even just as you're talking about how it gets darker as well, the advertising gets a lot darker too, because you have that series of images, actually, the Destro and the Zartan and the Grunt advertisements, like collect 4 infantrymen to get the infantryman free. You have that Zartan where bits of his mask is kind of splayed out over the tree behind him. You got that, and they're very darker toned advertisements than you got even a year prior. But they're very striking advertisements. And they're from that Cobra. They're from that Cobra era.
Those adverts are sensational. They're way better than any 8-year-old should deserve.
In the same way that you got
advertising
that
a little plastic man.
In the same way that Brian Boland TIE Fighter is far better than it deserves to be. These are of the same class, I think. Yeah, so the Untamed, Untethered, Unleashed ads, they are fantastic, and again, they're all from that Cobra era.
And there's another one here. Paddy mentioned the Zartan ad, so let me just show that one. I'm going to stop sharing here.
That's not part of the comic. That is an actual toy advertisement.
Advertisement at the time.
It's like collect five proofs of purchase.
Here's Grunt rotting away in a cell with a skeleton behind him. And there is that's a 3D version, yeah, with the swamp skier broken up, and then the face on the tree, Zartan's mask.
That is actually awesome in 3D. Wow.
Oh, we were saying as well, if we get to do more volumes, I would love to include these ads and try do a 3D glasses. Include a pair of 3D glasses in it if we do get to do subsequent volumes, so you can see these ads in 3D.
Yeah, they're pretty good. Obviously, just to clarify for people, those ads are from that kind of that later G.I. Joe Cobra era of Action Force. So they're not in these 3 volumes. This is very much, as I said earlier, the Palitoy Red Shadows era. But yes, those Gary Leach adverts are amazing. They're beautiful pieces, and it would be lovely to see them in print again at some point in the future.
The pre-Duke era, because you kind of get to that point, and Duke is such a driving force on the Action Force side once he gets introduced.
Oh yeah,
key character, much more so even than in G.I. Joe, in the comics at least. But yeah, before that point, we don't have so much the G.I. Joe characters, but we do have the likes of Quarrel and Red Jackal.
Jammer.
Gaucho. So we don't have Gung Ho, but we've got Gaucho. Yeah, so there's some familiar looking faces, if not quite the same names. And we've got Snake Eyes. I don't know if he appears in any of the volumes.
Well,
volumes
so Snake Eyes only shows up once in Palitoy Action Force. Twice. He's in the background in one story, and then he gets a one shot story in one of the annuals. Where obviously
it's called Snake Hunt.
Snake Hunt, that's right.
Careful saying.
Where he basically he's a sole survivor from a crashing Action Force aircraft, and he has to hunt Destro and a squad of Cobra Troopers in the jungle. So that's the only appearance Snake Eyes gets, other than a background shot in another story. And obviously Snake Eyes was never released by Palitoy in Action Force cards. So why they did a one-shot story, which is one of the best one-shot stories, by the way. Why they did that, I just don't understand, because the toy was not out. Well, there wasn't a hint of them releasing that Snake Eyes version 1 at the time.
Just as well, when we did get Snake Eyes, it was actually with the Z4 or the SAS Force Panther Jeep. The driver was the Snake Eyes action figure, but he was called Stalker over here. And
he was painted. He had paint on him as well.
Paint on his kind of mask. Now, Stalker does make quite a few appearances in the comics, in the SAS 4 stories, but they never show him with his full mask on. He wears the typical uniform of his SAS, comrades. So he's got like the beanie cap. His face is exposed, and of course he talks. He talks a lot. So.
You do get, I think you get one image of him in the mask in the data file, right? You can see him driving the Panther with the mask on. Yeah, I think that's the only masked shot you get of him.
Yeah. So again, from those people who grew up with G.I. Joe in America, we do have some of those, I feel like, likenesses in the Action Force mythology, but it is a completely unique universe. It's not borrowing from G.I. Joe in any way. It's completely its own thing. It's a completely original universe. It just had to reflect Palitoy's sales strategy, which they were reselling some of the G.I. Joe products, but reinventing it with additional tooling, different colorways, different decals, things like that.
And when we get to that era, the G.I. Joe, some of those G.I. Joe characters get sort of fleshed out almost more than they did in the American comics.
And they're quite different as well, because their backgrounds are different to how they are in the US. Because Scarlet gets a bit more time in Action Force than she did in G.I. Joe.
Yeah, true.
But it's not exactly the same Scarlet.
because there's a lot of these solo spotlight stories, obviously not for volume 1 to 3 here, but like exploring Recondo, Firefly, Flash, Storm Shadow, all of these great origins.
Zartan is very different
Major
in,
Bloods as
Action
well.
Force than he is in GI Joe. He's a bit more of a criminal, just a bad criminal person, a bit of a harder edge than the GI Joe's Zartan.
Well, I suppose the Zartan in Action Force is he's kind of a he's more like a kind of like a mutant freak, you know. He's really he's a strange character, and is but yet he again, he's not as he doesn't maybe get as much page time as his kind of American counterpart.
Yeah, the Battle Action Forces Artan is definitely very different, very sinister, very creepy sort of character. Moving to a different subject, across that sweep of the Battle Action Force comics, there's a lot of material there, and certainly more than 3 volumes worth. You're making 3 initial volumes, but what's it going to take for there to be more?
Well, we've got there's about, at a conservative estimate, there's about 2,500 pages of Action Force material, was between the stories and then supporting material like covers, character data files, combat files, things like that, that would have been printed. And that's conservative. I mean, if I was to take the time to work it out, it would probably be closer to the 3,000 pages. So there's about 800 pages collected in these 3 volumes here. So potentially there could be another 3, 4, 5, 6 volumes of books, to really bring the whole thing together. Right now, the license is just for these 3. So, any future releases are kind of subject to kind of license or approval, and obviously performance of how this goes as well. So, the initial kind of uptake, has been really positive from people, getting on board to pre-order and support the project, which is really good. I'm really, really happy about that. But right now, that the focus is just for me is to get the work completed on these books. I have a deadline for when I have to get to print in order to meet that December delivery. So that's where my focus is on that. And then, of course, once we have the books in hand in December, it's going to be processing those orders. So working with our fulfillment partners to get the books out there. And I would be hopeful that most, if not all, of our pre-order customers would have their books in time for Christmas. So that's I can't promise that for everybody, but certainly that is what we're going to do our damnedest.
That certainly is the goal, and I think we're very we've done a few of these projects now with the Total Action Force books and so on. We always want to make sure we over deliver. If we tell people we'll have it by a certain date, we want to make sure people get it done. And so we tend to, and I do this as well, when we're working on one thing, that's all we really work on. So, it'll come to a point in like maybe September, October, myself and Brian have a conversation about, okay, what's next? What's the plan for 2025? That tends to be how we do things, where we try to take one thing at a time and make sure that it gets done correctly and on time. I think I can speak for both of us where the desire is there to get as much of this out there as possible. But it really does depend on the reaction and the appetite. We are the least powerful people in this scenario. There are license holders here and licensors that we need to answer to. As much as we would love to do everything, we are dependent on people giving us permissions. And it really sometimes, when you're dealing with licensed projects, and not even just from Hasbro, from other people we've been in touch with over the years, things can change like the wind. If you have a change of management in the license holder, suddenly people you were talking to are no longer there. People you had built up relationships are no longer there, and you have to start building those relationships again. And this is why these things do take time when you're dealing with licensed projects.
I mean, there's kind of every likelihood of kind of seeing it, but at this time we can't really kind of comment or make a commitment on it. It's just these 3 volumes are what's sitting in front of us right now. We've got to get them done really, really well, get them out to people who pre-order. And you know what happens once we can confirm kind of release dates for projects in 2025, we're going to be talking about them loud and proud on our own socials, here on Talking Joe, on the Full Force, and anywhere. Anyone who's going to have us on their show, we'll be there talking about them and spreading the word.
And you know, the licensors look at the reactions. You know, the Rebellion and Hasbro both have, you know, departments that monitor social media. They both have editors that monitor social media. They know if the reaction to something is good, and I think that's part of the reason why we were able to, you know, get permissions to do these things, is because Hasbro have seen what we put out before in terms of the Total Action Force books. They were impressed by the Total Action Force books, and that bought us a little bit of goodwill, I think it's fair to say.
Well, our reputation is for quality. You know, everything that we've done, the reputation is for quality, and that's something we've been working on improving ever since the first book that me and Paddy did, which was Total Retaliation, which focused on the G.I. Joe Retaliation toy line. You know, we did that was a really super low budget book, and we did everything we could to kind of make that as good quality as we could make it. And when that was first released, it actually got great reviews. Yeah, you've got it there. It got that got great reviews from the people who bought it online. I mean, it went down really, really well with the G.I. Joe fans, and that kind of spurred us on to kind of to take it a bit further. The follow up was Hacks.
With Total Retaliation, we got a lot of Total Retaliation. We even got contact from Hasbro at the time to say it had been very well received.
That's right, yeah. Mark Webber and Daryl the Priest were both in touch to kind of say well done on that. That was really, really great to get.
And that was an unofficial project as well. So,
but then, you know, with our Action Force books, Mark, which you have kind of, you know, over your shoulder there, you know, we're super proud of those books. And again, they took the quality up a whole other level in terms of kind of print finish and design finish. And this new project is no different. It's taken it to another level again.
Yeah. And I think when people see the finished volumes in hand, like even Brian had some of the mock-up art, as I said, at JoeFest, and Mark, you might have seen some of those volumes of the remastered art. It looks so good. That Brian has spent nearly 9 months now at this stage remastering the art for these volumes.
Yeah, I'm super pleased with how it's turned out. And that was at Enniskillen Comic Fest. We met up with David MacDonald, our kind of co-creator on the Total Action Force books, and got to show David some of the proofs of the various pages. We had proofs from Volume 3 there and Volume 1, and David, who does a lot of kind of reprinting licensed material Rebellion with his own company, Hibernia, he was really delighted when he saw that the quality of the reprint on those proofs. So getting positive feedback from him really meant a lot, because he's somebody who's specifically in that industry doing the reprinted material.
Total Storm Force. Maybe that's that's one that you don't need Hasbro's involvement.
We wouldn't need Hasbro's permission for that, Brian.
No. We still need Rebellion's permission. They might say no.
We still need Rebellion's permission, but I mean, the Rebellion have actually been very easy to deal with, because, you know, they, like I said, they own this stuff and they would like to make money from it, and so once you come to them with a licensing fee, Rebellion are surprisingly easy to deal with.
And let me explain for those not familiar, not particularly our American audience, when Action Force was lost from the pages of Battle Action Force, that was a very big gap, because there was a lot of material that was being run in the book relating to Action Force, and then obviously a lot of the audience who were buying that book on a weekly basis were there for that Action Force content. So they very quickly, i.e. the next week, swapped out Action Force for a brand new team called Storm Force. I believe Barry Tomlinson was behind the creation of that. The art was by John Cooper and the Vanyu brothers. So very Action Forcey adventure team, filling in the gap that Action Force had left behind.
Kind of lean into the sci-fi elements and so on as well.
Instead of a cobra snake themed baddie, they had a spider themed baddie. So, the giant leap.
The Storm Force material is something that I'm not as familiar with, but people that I've spoken to about it, people who continued reading Battle after Action Force left, they have great things to say about Storm Force.
They do, yeah.
Here's one of them.
Hey!
Ryan.
Okay, so Ryan's definitely not into, not going to be in for luxury Storm Force reprints, but somewhere out there,
the fans are out there. People,
and we will find it.
I mean, I can't personally comment on Storm Force because I haven't read it, but I've enough curiosity to want to read it before I make up my mind.
I mean, it's Vanyo, Brian.
It's the wrap up, the elevators coming down to, we're approaching the ground floor. You've got a few seconds left to convince the...
TotalToyBooks.com, the early bird pre-order is going until August the 18th in the morning for UK people, August 17th for American listeners. They will be available after that, and they are going to be, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say it, but they will be widely distributed.
Well, what I would say is that your best bet right now is to get the pre-order in. And as Paddy said, deadline is at midnight Pacific time on August 17th. But you can pre-order after that date, but you will not get the 3-for-2 deal, which is what's right up there. So it's 3 volumes for the price of 2 right now, and that goes till midnight, August 17th. And TotalToyBooks.com is the place to order to get that pre-order in.
Yeah, you won't get them cheaper than there, basically at that. Yeah,
and then of course, future kind of distribution channels, we'll announce them kind of nearer the time. But right now, Total Toy Books is the place to get it and to pre-order.
That's great, and I feel really personally invested that I want you guys to make a big success of this, because it feels like that's going to be the way that we get volumes 4 onwards. So, as well as enjoying 1 through 3, each those volumes sound absolutely great. 1, a great introduction, 2, some big epics, and 3, some amazing art. Let's make this a success and keep on going.
And if we do get to do, you may have seen from Brian's volume 1 there, we have a piece of art going across all the spines of all 3 volumes. Brian has an idea how to continue that art. So the desire is there, as I say. But let's see how these go first.
People who got to meet us at JoeFest got to see the 3 volumes that we had on display. They had the spines all stack up, and they form an image of a particular character. So if you're at JoeFest, you got an exclusive.
That's great. That's where you can be found. Talking Joe can be found at talkingjoe.co.uk. That is the website with links to all the places where we are and our social medias, etc. Our focus is very much on G.I. Joe comics. We release an episode pretty much every single Thursday about a G.I. Joe comic of some description. Currently, we are covering the new Skybound run, as well as delving back into the history of Devil's Due and other things like this. We're on Patreon, patreon.com/talkingjoe, where people can get early access and extra content. So big thanks to our backers: Richard, Sam, Jay, Bill, Christopher, Justin, Rob, Shane, Ryan, Simon, Chris, Joe, Craig, Frank, and Mike, all in one breath, who are getting early access to episodes and exclusive content. So that is us done, I think. And why don't you join me in singing us out as we remember that nobody beats Talking Joe, an international podcast.
Nobody beats Talking Joe, an international podcast.
You have to do it like the intro for the ads, Brian. It has to be like, nobody beats Talking Joe, an international podcast.
That'll do, I think. That'll do.
I was going more fucking jazzy kind of, Club singer.
No, you have to do it like the ads. You have to do it like the ads.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Paddy.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks to all of our listeners.
Thanks, everyone.
Haters.